Hello everyone and welcome to my channel YNR Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Jack Abbott never planned to become the villain in the public eye, but as he stood alone in his office at Abbott, staring at the Chicago skyline through the glass, the echo of Victor Newman's smug voice replayed in his mind like a taunt that refused to fade, reminding him of every manipulation, every betrayal, every ruthless move Victor had made not just against him but against his entire family for decades, and for the first time in years Jack realized that beating Victor in business wasn't enough anymore because Victor Newman didn't care about losing money the way other men did. He cared about power, legacy and reputation, and most of all, he cared about how the world saw him and Nikki as the untouchable royal couple of Genoa City. So Jack made a decision that would change everything, a decision that crossed an invisible line between rivalry and total war. And it began quietly, with a single phone call to a media consultant in New York, who specialized in reputation management. A euphemism Jack understood meant controlled destruction, and within days carefully leaked stories began to appear online, nothing outrageous at first, just subtle reminders of Victor's past scandals, his questionable business tactics, anonymous sources questioning Newman Enterprises' ethics, whispers about hush money and offshore accounts, and Jack watched from afar as the internet did what it always did best, connecting dots, speculating, and amplifying every dark rumor Victor thought he'd buried long ago, while Nikki Newman, unaware of the storm brewing, attended a charity gala smiling beside her husband, unaware that the same reporters photographing her elegant gown were also preparing questions that would shatter her composure, because Jack had made sure the timing was perfect, releasing information just as Nikki was being celebrated as a symbol of resilience and grace, forcing the press to contrast her image with Victor's darker narrative. And when the headlines finally broke, they hit like a bombshell inside the Newman empire. Questions about power, control, and silence, followed by another piece titled Nikki Newman, Icon or Complicit? And within hours Genoa City was buzzing, social media exploding with debates, memes, and resurfaced footage of Victor's past arrests, court battles, and ruthless takeovers, while Jack sat calmly in his office, his expression unreadable as Kyle burst in waving his phone, demanding to know if his father had anything to do with the chaos unfolding, but Jack only responded with a quiet, controlled statement that sent a chill through the room, saying Victor had taken plenty from the Abbotts over the years and now it was time for the truth to collect its debt. Meanwhile at the Newman ranch, Victor watched the news in silence, his jaw tightening as anchors dissected his legacy, and for the first time Nikki saw something close to fear in her husband's eyes. Not fear of losing money, but fear of losing control over the narrative he had spent a lifetime shaping, and when Nikki confronted Victor, demanding to know if the allegations were true, the cracks in their marriage began to show, because Victor's instinct was to deflect, to dominate, to silence, but Nikki was no longer willing to be protected by half-truths, especially when her name was being dragged into the mess, and as she stormed out of the room, Victor made his own call, ordering his legal team to find the source. But the problem Victor faced was that the information wasn't fabricated, it was real, carefully curated, and devastatingly timed, and every attempt to deny it only fueled further scrutiny, while Jack's plan continued to unfold like a chess match, with opinion pieces questioning Nikki's role at Newman Enterprises, talk shows debating whether she had enabled Victor's behavior out of loyalty or fear, and Jack knew that while Victor would fight back publicly, privately this attack cut deeper than any hostile takeover ever had. Because Victor's greatest weakness was his belief that his family was his shield, and now that shield was cracking, as Nikki found herself isolated, judged, and furious that Victor's past sins were becoming her burden to bear, and when she finally confronted Jack at society, the tension was electric, Nikki accusing him of cruelty, of exploiting her pain to punish Victor, and Jack didn't deny it, instead calmly telling her that Victor had never hesitated to use the Abbott's loved ones as leverage, and this was simply justice arriving late. But Nikki's hurt was real, her voice breaking as she admitted she felt humiliated, exposed, and betrayed by a world that once adored her, and for a brief moment Jack almost faltered, almost apologized, but the memory of Victor destroying his family hardened his resolve, because this war was bigger than guilt, it was about ending Victor's reign of fear once and for all, and as the scandal deepened, sponsors pulled back from Nikki's foundation. Board members at Newman Enterprises demanded emergency meetings, and even Victor's children began questioning him behind closed doors. forcing Victor to face something he had avoided his entire life, accountability, while Jack watched the fallout with a mix of satisfaction and unease, knowing he had struck a blow that could never be undone, because reputations, once shattered, never fully recover, and in Genoa City, where image was everything, Jack Abbott had finally done what no one else had dared to do. He hadn't just challenged Victor Newman, he had exposed him, dragging his shadow into the light, and as Victor stood alone at the ranch late one night, staring at the family portrait on the wall, he whispered Jack's name like a vow, promising retribution, unaware that the damage Jack had unleashed wasn't just external, it was eating away at the very foundation of Victor and Nikki's marriage, their legacy, and the myth of invincibility they had built together, setting the stage for a war that would redefine Genoa City forever. The silence at the Newman ranch after the media storm felt heavier than any shouted argument Victor had ever won, because for the first time in his life his power couldn't bully the truth back into submission, and as he stared at the darkened living room, the glow of his phone illuminating headline after headline dissecting his past like a corpse on a stainless steel table, Victor realized Jack Abbott hadn't just attacked him. He had dismantled the illusion Victor depended on to survive. And when Nikki finally returned home hours later, her eyes were red not from tears but from fury. She didn't raise her voice, didn't throw accusations like weapons the way Victor expected. Instead she spoke quietly, asking a single question that landed harder than any scream ever could, asking how much of what the media was saying was true, and Victor, the man who could negotiate billion-dollar deals without blinking, hesitated. And that hesitation told Nikki everything she needed to know, because for decades she had defended him, rationalized his cruelty, excused his darkness as strength, but now she was being forced to see herself through the eyes of a public that suddenly viewed her not as a survivor, but as an accessory. And when she told Victor she was stepping down from all public roles at Newman Enterprises until the investigation ended, Victor exploded, accusing Jack of poisoning her mind, of turning her against her own husband. But Nikki didn't flinch, calmly reminding Victor that Jack hadn't written Victor's history, he had only revealed it, and that truth shattered something between them that even Victor's iron will couldn't repair, because Nikki left that night, taking only a suitcase and her dignity, moving into a hotel under an alias while tabloids hunted for her every move, and Jack, hearing about Nikki's departure, felt a hollow ache settle in his chest, because while he had anticipated Victor's rage, he hadn't fully considered the collateral damage, yet he told himself this was necessary, that empires built on fear deserved to collapse under scrutiny, even as Kyle confronted him again, accusing Jack of becoming the very thing he despised, warning that once you weaponized the truth, there was no controlling where it landed, but Jack dismissed his son's concerns, convinced that Victor would survive but be weakened, never imagining that Victor Newman, wounded and humiliated, was most dangerous when backed into a corner. Because Victor didn't plan retaliation through lawsuits or press releases, he planned it personally, starting by isolating Jack, quietly reaching out to old allies, reviving grudges and exploiting fractures within the Abbott family, leaking stories of Jack's past addictions, failed marriages and moral compromises, creating a narrative that framed Jack not as a crusader for truth, but as a bitter rival seeking revenge, and soon Genoa City found itself divided, with some praising Jack for exposing corruption, while others accused him of hypocrisy, forcing Jabot's board into crisis meetings and threatening investor confidence. And as Jack faced growing pressure, he realized Victor's counterattack was surgical, designed not to destroy Jack outright, but to erode his support system piece by piece, while Nikki, watching the war unfold from her hotel room, found herself torn between anger at Victor and guilt over Jack's suffering, haunted by the knowledge that her marriage had helped create the monster now devouring everyone around them. And when she finally agreed to an exclusive interview, hoping to reclaim her voice, the decision proved catastrophic, because under the bright studio lights, the interviewer pressed her harder than she expected, asking whether she had ever knowingly covered up Victor's crimes, and Nikki, exhausted and emotionally raw, faltered, admitting she had looked the other way more times than she cared to admit. And that confession became the headline heard around the world, sending shockwaves through Newman Enterprises and causing Victor to watch in stunned silence as the woman he loved unintentionally delivered the most devastating blow of all. And in that moment Victor realized Jack hadn't truly beaten him, Nikki had, and that realization twisted into resentment, poisoning what remained of their bond, while Jack, watching the interview replay late into the night, felt no triumph, only a grim understanding that the war had escalated beyond control. Because now, Victor wasn't just fighting to protect his empire, he was fighting to punish those he believed had betrayed him, including Nikki. And as Genoa City braced itself for the next explosion, one truth became painfully clear: Jack Abbott's strike at Victor's reputation had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, but in doing so he had unleashed a chain reaction of betrayals, confessions, and consequences that would redefine alliances, destroy marriages, and prove once and for all that in Genoa City, no victory came without blood on the floor and scars that never truly healed. The morning Genoa City woke to after Nikki's explosive interview felt like the calm after an earthquake, deceptive and fragile, because beneath the surface the aftershocks were already tearing through boardrooms, bedrooms, and long-standing loyalties, and Jack Abbott sensed it the moment he stepped into Jabot and saw the uneasy looks from employees who once greeted him with confidence, because Victor Newman's counteroffensive had reached a new level, not loud or obvious but insidious, spreading doubt about Jack's motives, integrity, and stability. And while Jack told himself he could weather it, privately he felt the strain, the weight of knowing that every choice he'd made had pushed the entire city closer to collapse. And yet he couldn't stop now, because stopping would mean Victor won, and Victor Newman never truly won unless his enemy begged for mercy, something Jack refused to do, even as Phyllis urged him to consider the human cost, warning him that Nikki was unraveling and that Victor, humiliated beyond endurance, was no longer playing defense but preparing something far darker, something personal. And as if summoned by that warning, Victor made his move, not through the media this time, but through the law, quietly cooperating with federal investigators, offering them selective access to Newman Enterprises records, positioning himself not as the target but as the whistleblower. And within days rumors spread that Jabot itself was under scrutiny for past mergers, questionable accounting during Jack's tenure, and unresolved allegations tied to his years of addiction, forcing Jack into closed-door meetings with lawyers who advised him to step aside temporarily, a suggestion that infuriated him because stepping aside would look like guilt. And yet the pressure mounted, investors nervous, allies wavering, and Kyle watching his father with growing fear that this war was destroying the man he admired. While Nikki, now virtually isolated, found herself caught between two titans who both claimed to care about her but seemed willing to destroy everything around them to win. And as she sat alone in her hotel room staring at the city lights, she realized something terrifyingly simple, that she had been defined by Victor for so long she no longer knew who she was without him, and that realization pushed her toward a decision she had avoided her entire life: independence, a word that frightened her more than any headline because it meant standing alone against the consequences of her past choices. And when she announced she was entering a long-term treatment program, not just for sobriety but for clarity, the public response was mixed, sympathy clashing with skepticism, but Victor interpreted it as abandonment, a betrayal he could neither forgive nor understand, and in his anger he lashed out, freezing joint accounts, canceling protections he had always extended to Nikki, proving that when Victor felt wounded, love became collateral damage. And Jack, hearing of Victor's actions, felt a surge of rage that surprised even him, because for all his calculated strikes, he had never intended for Nikki to be punished for telling the truth, and that anger drove him to confront Victor directly at the Newman ranch, a confrontation that crackled with decades of resentment, Victor accusing Jack of orchestrating Nikki's downfall, Jack accusing Victor of destroying her himself, and for a moment it seemed the two men might finally come to blows, but instead Victor delivered a chilling revelation, telling Jack that he had ensured the investigation into Jabot would accelerate unless Jack publicly retracted his support of the media leaks, a demand Jack refused, declaring that he would not be silenced by threats. And as Jack left the ranch, he knew the line between business war and personal vendetta had been erased completely, because now Victor wasn't just trying to win, he was trying to ruin Jack's life. And that realization forced Jack to look inward, to confront the possibility that in his obsession with ending Victor's tyranny, he had sacrificed his own moral ground, a thought that haunted him late into the night as he replayed Nikki's interview and saw not a symbol or a pawn, but a woman finally breaking free, even if the cost was unbearable. And as weeks passed, Genoa City transformed into a battlefield of whispers and shifting alliances, with board members resigning, charities collapsing, friendships dissolving under suspicion, and the once clear lines between hero and villain blurring into moral gray. Until one explosive day when federal agents arrived at Newman Enterprises with warrants, cameras capturing Victor's fury as he was escorted into a private interrogation room, a moment that shocked the city and sent Jack reeling, because despite everything, he hadn't anticipated seeing Victor brought low so publicly, and yet even as the image went viral, Victor remained defiant, using the moment to cast himself as a persecuted patriarch, while Nikki, watching from the treatment center, felt both relief and sorrow, knowing that this was the reckoning she had feared and perhaps needed, but also understanding that no outcome would restore what had been lost, and as Jack faced his own looming legal challenges, he began to understand the true cost of striking Victor where it hurt most, that destroying a reputation was not a single blow but a slow-burning fire that consumed everyone in its path, leaving behind ashes of marriages, legacies, and illusions. And in Genoa City, as night fell and the city lights flickered on, one truth settled heavily over them all, that this war was far from over, and the final casualties had yet to be claimed, because in a town built on secrets and power, the truth was the most dangerous weapon of all, and once unleashed, it never stopped demanding a price. The fallout from Victor's public interrogation spread through Genoa City like poison through water, invisible at first but lethal in its reach, and as the cameras replayed footage of him entering the federal building with his jaw set and eyes blazing, Jack Abbott felt a conflicting surge of vindication and dread, because this was the moment he had aimed for yet never fully imagined, the mighty Victor Newman forced to answer for decades of intimidation and manipulation. And yet Jack also understood that Victor never truly lost unless he chose to, and Victor Newman never chose defeat. He adapted to it, weaponized it, and turned it into fuel for retaliation, and even as federal agents questioned him, Victor was already calculating, already identifying who would pay for this humiliation, and at the top of that list was Jack, whose life began unraveling with alarming speed as subpoenas followed, demanding documents, testimony, and explanations for past business decisions that had once seemed safely buried, forcing Jack to confront his own history with painful honesty, including moments when he had crossed ethical lines in the name of survival, moments Victor now used to paint Jack as a hypocrite masquerading as a crusader. And while Jack prepared for legal battles, Kyle watched helplessly as his father aged before his eyes, the confidence that once defined him replaced by sleepless nights and quiet doubt, because Kyle knew that even if Jack survived this war, he would never emerge unchanged. And meanwhile Nikki, shielded from the chaos by the sterile calm of the treatment center, found herself confronting memories she had suppressed for years, moments when she had chosen silence over truth, loyalty over conscience, and as counselors urged her to forgive herself, Nikki realized forgiveness was meaningless without accountability, and for the first time she considered testifying fully, openly, not to protect Victor or punish Jack, but to finally speak without fear, a decision that terrified her because she knew Victor would see it as the ultimate betrayal, and yet something inside her insisted that continuing to hide would destroy what remained of her soul. And as whispers of Nikki's possible cooperation reached Victor through back channels, his fury ignited into something colder and more dangerous than rage, because Victor could endure enemies, he could even endure defeat, but betrayal from the woman he loved struck at the core of his identity, unraveling the narrative he had told himself about family as loyalty without limits. And in response Victor began isolating himself, refusing visits, cutting off communication, focusing entirely on strategy, while his children grew increasingly alarmed by his rigidity, sensing that the man who had once protected them at all costs was now willing to sacrifice anyone to preserve his pride. And as Genoa City braced for Nikki's next move, Jack made a shocking decision of his own, stepping down temporarily as CEO of Jabot, not as an admission of guilt but as a statement of responsibility, hoping to stabilize the company and protect his family from further damage. And though the board accepted his resignation with reluctant gratitude, the public reaction was divided, some seeing it as noble, others as confirmation of Victor's narrative. And Jack, stripped of his position, found himself wandering his home in silence, forced to confront who he was without power, a question Victor had never allowed himself to ask. And it was in that vulnerable space that Jack finally acknowledged the possibility that his war against Victor had been fueled not just by justice but by unresolved envy and resentment, emotions he had buried under years of rivalry. And as this realization settled in, Nikki made her move, announcing through her attorney that she would cooperate fully with investigators, a statement that sent shockwaves through Genoa City and triggered Victor's most ruthless response yet, as he publicly disavowed her, claiming he had been misled and betrayed, framing himself as a victim of both Jack's machinations and Nikki's weakness. A narrative that stunned even his most loyal supporters, because it revealed a man willing to rewrite history to preserve his own legend. And when Nikki watched Victor's statement from the treatment center, tears streamed down her face not from fear but from grief, because she finally understood that the love she had defended for decades had always been conditional, dependent on silence and submission, and that understanding freed her even as it broke her heart. And as legal proceedings intensified, alliances across Genoa City shifted rapidly, old enemies becoming uneasy allies, friends turning cautious, everyone calculating where to stand as the ground beneath them shifted, and Jack and Nikki, once connected only by Victor's shadow, found themselves unexpectedly aligned, not romantically but morally, bound by a shared resolve to stop enabling Victor's tyranny, even if it meant destroying what remained of their own reputations. And in private conversations they acknowledged their mutual guilt and pain, recognizing that accountability was not about winning but about ending a cycle of harm that had defined their lives. And as Victor prepared for trial, his once unshakable confidence cracked under the weight of isolation, because for the first time the walls he had built were closing in. And yet even then he refused to express regret, insisting to anyone who would listen that power justified its cost. And as Genoa City waited for the courtroom battle that would decide Victor's fate, one truth became undeniable, that Jack's initial strike against Victor's reputation had evolved into a reckoning far larger than any of them, exposing not just the sins of one man but the complicity of an entire community that had benefited from his dominance. And as the city held its breath, the question was no longer who would win, but who would survive with their humanity intact, because in a world built on power and secrets, the most radical act was finally telling the truth, no matter how devastating the consequences.